Workforce Development. He returned to the department about a year ago after spending 2 years with McDowell Group. Prior to that, he worked as a statewide economist for the department for 8 years. Dan's work experience has included time at a Washington, D.C. energy consulting firm, a New York City law firm, and the Alaska Attorney General's office in Anchorage and Juneau. Apparently, he's also delivered a lot of pizzas. Dan is a graduate of Utah State University and Cornell Law School. Please help me welcome Dan Robinson.
Thank you. Okay, let's fire this up. It's just gonna, I think it's on power save, but
yeah, I think it is
I'm on
power save.
here.
You're on, your screen's not on.
Oh, let me get my, I think that'll fire up. Yeah, I really am most proud of the pizzas. And, you know, I'm a professional estimator. If I delivered pizza for, I don't know, 6 years maybe. I bet I've delivered 100,000 pizzas. I have to do that math, but I don't like introductions. Introductions are hard. You know, it's hard to hear yourself be introduced. We getting up? Okay, we're getting there.
I think it's just warming up a little.
So I don't know what you guys were told, but I'm kind of I'm a pitch hitter, and I came up with, I had to think of a title kind of quickly. So the one I came up with, everyone likes lists and everyone likes talking about the future, maybe. I mean, you're judging by magazine covers, the top 10 or, you know, what's going to happen next year. So I went with the what's going to happen 2020, conveniently because the Department of Labor has already got some numbers out there. So we're going to talk about 2020. Let's see, I'm off here, aren't I? So 2020, I'm trying to remember what the title was. Alaska 2020, how many jobs, how many people? And then we're going to talk a little bit about Juneau too, because we have data about everything and everyone. I know how, let's see. It's a little scary.
You're going to make us nervous.
Yeah. So, let's start here. And I'm going to be in the way. Let's see, how about, it's not really critical that you see, but is this the best kind of basic arrangement without me going to the back of the room? Okay. All right. So as I said, how many jobs, how many people? We'll start with how many jobs. 300. Now this is 2020. Okay, and this is not a news flash. These numbers are out there. This one's been out there for a few months. 362,159. So everybody gasp, right, or do something. It's exciting. How many people, 2020? 802,764. So more gasps, right? So we're done. Any questions? Have you ever heard a story? You ever had somebody tell you a story about their boat or their engine or their nose job or their snow machine or whatever else? And the point of the story is a figure. And they say, and it cost, you know, $10,000 or $1,000 or $1 million. And this happens to me more often than it should. I think, is that a lot? You know, should I gasp that that's so high or that's so low? Because numbers need context, right? We don't know how much nose jobs are supposed to cost, and I don't know how much snow machines I do, but yeah. So let's talk a little bit about context. You know, what do those numbers mean? This is Alaska. We'll start with employment. And one of the ways you get context is you look back in time to see, you know, is that number bigger or smaller than it used to be? Some of those kinds of things. So looking at employment over the last 50 years, and then looking ahead to 2020, you can see where the state has been. Clear down at 56,000 jobs in 1960, roughly 6 times as many by 2010, and then we're projecting or forecasting another 37,000 in the next 10 years. Still not a lot of context. Another thing we do is you compare with other states. Alaska in 2010 was the 47th biggest state. ahead of North Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming, in that order. So Wyoming has the least. D.C. also. We were the 50th smallest for a lot of years, but we'll talk more about our growth. In percent change, you see the numbers, but then a follow-up question is quite often, how fast are you growing? And you can see that in the 60s, pre-oil, we knew that oil was there, and we knew for sure the oil was there towards the end of the 60s. But that's strong growth. That's a young state, a small state, growing quite rapidly. In the 70s, things really take off. The 80s are interesting because we had a really strong growth period, and then we had a really rough recession. But when you go from 1980 to 1990, you still get quite strong growth. 90s were a little bit the opposite, just kind of steady growth. A lot of our resource, a lot of our commodities, the markets weren't that great. Fishing was at its best in the late 80s, struggled a little bit through the 90s with farmed fish. Oil prices weren't great. Tourism was growing. Timber was struggling. So, but we kept adding jobs. The economy was kind of slow and steady through the 90s. Mostly the same through the 2000s, and then you can see we're projecting slightly slower growth out to 2020. Well, we'll come back to that. So, and this is what the U.S. did. And this some more context. Alaska was growing quite a bit faster than the U.S. for those first 3 decades that we talked about. We were, again, a young state.
I want to pull this over just a little bit.
Okay.
We're missing that. Sorry, Dan.
No, and I was going to say too, I think we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions, but as we go through here, if there's a question about something on the chart, then feel free we're not getting anything out of this if the pictures don't make sense, so feel free to say, I don't know what that is, or I can't see that label or something. But this is the United States employment growth over that same period. When we were a younger state, we were small enough. We were kind of like a teenager. They grow no matter what you feed them. We were going to grow because we were small. And that's an overstatement because it wasn't obvious that we were going to grow or what kind of state we would be at statehood. And then some big things happened, oil being the biggest one. But then we do kind of level out, and by the 90s, we're growing about the same as the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy had a recession, and part of another one in that period. Alaska didn't, as I said, we just kept growing. Nothing too exciting. It felt, if anything, some people would describe it as stagnant. I mean, it was slow growth, but it wasn't terribly exciting. On the other hand, there was nothing really bad happening. There was no 80s style recession. You get to this 2000-2010 period, and the most noteworthy thing there is just how deep the U.S. recession is over the course of the 10-year period. And if you look from 2000 to 2005, the U.S. would be quite a bit higher than what Alaska had. But then the U.S. recession was very deep. Lots of, I'm trying to remember net job loss. We're still millions of jobs, maybe 2 or 3. I should know that. Anyway, the U.S. economy is still millions of jobs below where it was pre-recession. Alaska has long since recovered the small job loss that we had in the recession. And then to the extent the people, us and the U.S., our colleagues who do this for the nation know anything, our projections are that Alaska's economy will add a slightly smaller percent of jobs in the U.S. economy. Now, so just briefly here, we do this every 2 years, a 10-year occupational forecast. And the time period is 2010 to 2020. So we are projecting 37,000 new jobs. We assign each of your companies is assigned to an industry, and then we'll look at occupations in a minute. But by industry, you see something really sticking out here, healthcare. Healthcare has been sticking out since at least since the 90s as a strong, much stronger than average growth industry. So there's that happening, and then the other really big thing happening that makes us quite confident that not so much the precision of the numbers, but that healthcare will have strong growth is the baby boomers are just entering the retirement years, and we get older, we require a little more healthcare, obviously. So well, let's see. This actually surprised me. I was thinking it was later. But this is one of the key points I wanted to mention here, especially during political season, and when somebody's trying to sell you something, we sometimes scare each other, right? Or we overpromise about what can happen. So, quite often when we present our numbers, there's drama lacking because economies are big and they're complicated. Industries are different. Industries, things can happen fast, but economies as a whole. So we talk about the number of jobs in the state's economy, or even Juneau's economy. We'll talk in a minute. The number of people in a state. Those things don't skyrocket or plummet overnight. They happen slowly. I've used before the analogy of a battleship or an aircraft carrier. But then I thought, well, I don't know with modern battleships and aircraft carriers, maybe they do turn on a dime and do fancy things. But I know from looking out my window that cruise ships move slowly, and nothing really happens fast. So occupationally, this is this is our best guess, and there's science behind the guess. But as to what occupations will add the most number of jobs. And you see here a couple of things. Again, you see healthcare, registered nurses, some of those other things. But you see also some occupations, personal care aides, retail salespersons, cashiers. These are occupations where you require bodies. And you require bodies when your economy is generally growing. There is a subset of this list that looks at the highly trained bodies, the kind of the things that universities need to get ready to train for, and the whole workforce development mechanism needs to think about. But in terms of the largest numbers, you see, like I said, some examples where we need somebody who can come to work, who can smile, who can bring you the pizza to the right address, and not get lost on the way back. Those kinds of things. And this too doesn't change terribly fast. When somebody's selling magazines or an idea, they'll say, technology is changing everything, and it is, but most definitely, and has changed everything, and will continue to. But those things don't happen really fast. We don't look out to 2020 and say it's going to be a different looking world. Or I think we're careful about how much we think that'll happen. So let's talk population now. Obvious relationship. This is a picture from 1880s Juneau tent city, and it's not a blurry picture. That's how things looked back then. They didn't have machine cuts. They didn't have a lot of paint. So that's really how things looked. What do I know? 1880, right? Say whatever I want. Here's a picture that I say it's worth 1,000 words, at least 1,000 words. Hope nobody counts. I promise to keep it under 1,000 words. But this let's get our bearings a little bit. The blue line is natural increase, so that's births minus deaths, and you can see off to the left the scale. And then the yellow line is net migration, so the number of people moving here minus the number of people moving out. You see, as you would expect, not a whole lot of difference in what natural increase contributes year to year. But you do see, especially over some key periods, a big difference in how much migration contributed to our state growing. I think the World War II, and then really the 50s, the aftermath of World War II, the establishment and the growth of our big military bases sometimes gets forgotten as a force in the state's development. That's a big reason why Anchorage is our population center. You think of the Alcan being built in that period. And then just all of the increased population due to actual soldiers being stationed here and their families. So there was that big effect you see in the 40s, and like I said, in the 50s, Korean War era. You see a buildup and a net migration increase during the Vietnam years. Then things get kind of wild with pipeline construction. Now this is population too, so this is not workers, this is people who lived here. In 2 years, in 74, 75, we added 50,000 residents when we were building the pipeline. You see, when we get towards the end of the 70s, that we give some of that back. But we don't, I think about 18,000 we give back. So a lot of those people, sometimes I hear people talk about, you know, people from outside built our pipeline. Kind of. I mean, they came from outside to build our pipeline. A whole lot of them stayed. They became Alaskans. Some of them went home and found other jobs. Similar phenomenon. The oil boom is interesting because that's when the money started to flow. Our real estate market went a little crazy, and there was money flowing. Alaska was the place of high salaries, so we get lots of in-migration. The U.S. economy also in the early 80s is in a terrible recession. So Alaska looks pretty inviting, and you get a lot of migration. Things go south, and we give some of it back, and then you see kind of some more smaller. Again, this is net, and Alaska more than any other state is affected by migration. We get about 45,000 people in, about 45,000 people out every year. Big migration flows, and this is net. Most years, as you see, especially in recent years, they roughly balance. When we get to this Great Recession note, we've seen that before, kind of a calculation between how good is Alaska's economy compared to how good is the lower 48 economy. If you're not terribly happy in your job here in 2008, you're probably not moving to Portland because you're not going to find a job there. When the U.S. economy is better, then we get more people leaving Alaska in small numbers, and then we also get fewer people moving to Alaska in small numbers. But like the other stuff, these are, like I said, these are big numbers. They don't change really fast over that what 60-year period. You know, we've got a handful of significant events that have really changed things. So here's population growth. We'll flip through these kind of quickly. You can see, similar to what we saw with employment, that Alaska's population growth quite a bit exceeded the U.S. population growth earlier in the century, and then resembled it for the last 1990 to 2000 decades. And then we are projecting slightly slower, but not much, population growth over the next decade. So Juneau, let's talk Juneau a little bit. You can see Juneau also had strong population growth going back through the 60s, 70s, 80s. Things flattened out, as a lot of you know, especially starting in the 90s, but really 2000, 2010, and our projections don't show particularly strong growth for Juneau. Some of the reasons for that are obvious. Sometimes people look at these numbers and say, well, you're missing something. You're missing something important. And we may be. But a lot of what happens is not, there's not a lot of uncertainty about it. Our age profile, for example. Juneau and Southeast is a little bit older than the rest of the state. We have fewer people having children. Our state workers, this is interesting to me, our state workers in Juneau are older than the state workers for the state overall. So we've got that big group of 50-somethings who are going to retire sometime. One of our big questions in doing projections is, are they going to retire at the same rate they always have? If they do, at the same rate, you know, if 1 out of every 4 leaves, we're going to be swimming in 60 and 70 and 80-year-olds, and we almost for sure are anyway. But potentially the rate will change, and the bargains will be good or whatever. We don't expect it'll change much. But that's a big question in terms of how Alaska's future looks. You just imagine for Juneau, if every state worker who retires and stays in Alaska and is replaced by somebody who moves to Juneau to replace them, you get some population growth. You get the retirees living here. You don't get a lot of employment growth. But since the numbers are so big, it'll be really interesting to watch and important for how these numbers, where they settle. So we look at percent change, and you see this even more starkly, just that Juneau's population growth has come way down. We are projecting growth. And this next slide is interesting to me. Well, just one more before I get to it. So Juneau's population has grown a little less. Southeast, in a lot of ways, a lot of this you know at least as well as I do. Southeast was the first population center. So Southeast is a little bit older as an economy. Southeast also didn't get, other than through state government, the boost from oil that certainly Anchorage got, North Slope, Fairbanks. We got a boost, but not as much. And then we also had the timber issue, a significant piece of our economy that's faded, not completely, but significantly. So Juneau it wasn't as much an adolescent in the 70s and 80s. We were a little bit farther along, so some of that was to be expected. But this is, I think, quite interesting. The latest population number we have is 2011, and you can see that we projected 32,000 people in Juneau in 2020 from a census count of 31,000 in 2010. Well, the 2011 estimate comes in at 32,290. We're almost to our 2020 forecast number, and it's a 1,000 population increase. If you look back over the 20 years that I've gotten on here individually, you don't see a lot of big changes, and you see a pretty well-established trend line. So the question is whether that 2011 number is an outlier. There's a quality there, or the other possibility that something is happening and growth has picked up. If 2012 comes in at 33,000 or something, then fairly quickly, and we do this all the time, every forecaster does, you adjust your projections. The next time we project out to 2020, it could be 36,000. So those things, yes, Brad?
How do you make your projections? I mean, do you base it on industry or trends in industry? Because what if we added 2 mines in Southeast?
Yeah.
I mean, it changes instantly. And so as you adjust your forecast, what are you adjusting to come up with these numbers? Yeah,
that's a good question, but and a good chance to reinforce that a new mine has an important effect, and we'll look at a pie chart in a minute to show that. But it doesn't. It's not a boulder going into a lake that sends waves everywhere. It's a pebble going into a lake. So we'll see what Kensington did in a minute to our numbers. A nice visible boost, but fairly small, back to that point that economies are complicated. But how we project, we don't try to figure out specific economic events. We don't say, Gravina Bridge, yes, Kensington, no, go through all the list of possibilities and weigh in one way or the other. For population, the basic projection methodology is you look at trends in natural increase. Natural increase is not very hard to figure out. You look at migration trends, and you look at the aging of the existing population primarily. And then broadly, you look at what is happening in the economy. But we don't have a list anywhere of our yes, no on different projects. And the gas line was tricky as we were projecting. At one point, the gas line was projected to happen, 2013 or something. Each projection cycle, you'd think if it was going to happen there, you'd think each projection cycle gets more and more certain. Well, huge projects happen this way. It's gotten less and less certain. It's completely out now of our projection horizon. It didn't figure into our calculations for 2020. That makes sense. It might come back in. We've been talking gas line for a lot of years, and it's a complicated thing. It was the same with other big projects. Does that answer your question, Brad? Okay. Did I got some blank slides? That's the last one I had. I just wanted to mention here the source for all of this data that I've shown. Most of it comes from Department of Labor. Some of it comes from Bureau of Labor Statistics. We produce these numbers in cooperation with them with a couple of different programs. Some of it came from the census. And I just wanted to mention that to say, partly because we spend a lot of time in our offices producing the numbers. We also talk about them occasionally, and we have a monthly publication. But I do think there's more use for them than I think we could do a better job alerting people to all that's out there. So and we know a fair amount about other data sources too, just because it's part of our calculation. So if you have a data question, if you're writing a grant, if you're trying to forecast something, then please feel free to give us a call, and we will see if we can help you either with our numbers or pointing you to some other numbers. And then there's my contact number, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
I thought you mentioned there's
Yeah, I don't know where my, that's it. That's what I was going to show you. And the one specifically, where did my pie charts go? It was Juneau by industry. I'm not sure what happened. Must have had a data snippet. But I'll tell you what it said, the key points. One was that mining as a share of total Juneau wages from 2002 to 2011 increased from 4% to 7%. There's Kensington. State government, let me just ask, what percent, and let me just, a couple of caveats. One, when we talk jobs, we're talking jobs where somebody gets a paycheck. We're not talking about fishing, and we're not talking about entrepreneurs. Because we don't have the data to track them. So the jobs where people get a paycheck is at least 2/3 of depending on how you define entrepreneurial activity, but most of us get a paycheck. There's an important piece that is self-employed. But what percent of wages do you think come from government in Juneau?
50%.
Bingo, exactly 50% in 2011. That's down just slightly from 2002 when it was 52%. So state government is about a quarter of that, about half of that, about 24% of the total. Local is pretty big, and local's a little fuzzy because the hospital's in with local, and a lot of communities the hospital's private, so that inflates the numbers a little bit. But Juneau's, what a surprise, really dependent on government. And then healthcare, you can see in the pie charts that I was going to show you back in my office. Grew a little bit, but not a lot. And again, that's a little dubious because Bartlett's in local government. And I think those were the main points. But yeah, I'd be glad to answer any questions. Yeah, Peggy Ann.
Hold on, stand up and introduce yourself.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. I know how much a bike costs.
Hey,
if somebody tells me a story about how much their bike costs, I will have the appropriate response.
I'm not going to ask you about that, but
Okay.
afterwards. Can you talk a little bit about the population of Southeast and June in relation to Southeast and
Sure.
there versus the rest of it?
Sure, yeah. That's really interesting because there's a lot of conventional wisdom about what's happening. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk about the villages are emptying into Anchorage. Migration, like a lot of things, is both ways in Alaska, within Alaska, just like it is other places. So that was never quite true. There was a slight adjustment, and like I said, there are always people moving to Anchorage, people moving out of Anchorage, and the same is true in Southeast. But what's also true is that the broad trend shows that within Southeast migration, Juneau's getting more than it's giving. All right, so Juneau's growing a little bit. To the extent Juneau's growing, some of it is because, and this won't surprise anyone, there are jobs here. So Juneau's getting some in-migration from within Southeast. Southeast is interesting because we have some, but we don't have all that much migration to and from the rest of the state. Southeast, if you're here, and some of it's as simple as proximity. You decide to leave, you're as likely to go to Seattle or Portland if you live in Southeast. And don't quote me on that. It's similar in numbers to moving to Anchorage. If you're working with government, obviously easier to transfer, university, lots of things, back and forth within the state, Fairbanks, Anchorage in particular. But so yeah, Juneau it has grown a little bit, whereas Southeast hasn't. In our projections, too, the same phenomenon. Juneau is showing a little bit of growth. Southeast, actually, through 2020 and I think 2030, is the only region that's not projected to grow at all, to lose a little bit of population over that period. We get people who really don't like to hear that, and one of our responses there is we're not saying it can't change. We talk to groups like yours, of all groups. You make things happen. That doesn't have to happen. We're talking about a current that's existing, but currents change. So that basically answer the question. Yeah, John, you had.
John Pugh from University. The demographics in Anchorage seem to have had a major shift in the last couple of decades in terms of their minority population, or particularly Asian population and so on. And are we seeing that same shift in Southeast that Anchorage is seeing in the mix and the demographics?
That's a good question. Let me just ask, what do you think our #1 international migrant source is? What country?
Philippines.
Exactly, Philippines and island Asia. I don't know enough to say. I would speculate that Juneau would have less of that because Juneau's had a little bit less churning generally. But we can look at that.
Because it seems like they were talking about their school district is now over 50% Alaska Native and Asian.
We've got an article coming about the shift, and it's a little ways off. I'm trying to remember the shift from the typical majority population, whites, becoming a plurality. I guess something less than 50%. That's on the horizon. But yeah, Juneau. Yeah, I'm not even going to speculate just because I don't want you to leave with the wrong idea. But we can look at that certainly. Yeah. Yeah, Rick.
Hi, Dan.
Good.
Rick Wolf, University of Alaska. Since nationally the number of net new private sector jobs comes so much from newer businesses, I wonder, is it possible and would it be valuable for you to be tracking new companies who are self-employed? Because that could be part of the trend.
Absolutely. And we do occasionally. There's a there's a product from the census called non-employer statistics that tracks people, entrepreneurs or self-employed people who have at least $1,000 in sales. But the main problem with tracking them is there's not, other than the IRS, a data source for them. Every couple of years we'll do an article on how many self-employed are out there. We do articles on fishing to try to get at how many people are fishing. But in terms of small businesses, I was just looking, we every year we put together a pie chart showing the slices of businesses. And this isn't employment, and it's a key difference. The number of businesses, the percentage of business with 0 to 4 employees in the state is 60-something. So the clear majority, if you count up businesses, have 0 to 4 employees. If you count employment, then the big employers employ the highest percentage of people. And job creation is interesting. There's a data set called Business Employment Dynamics that we try to track that. And you have to make a lot of assumptions with the data that's available to us about what job creation is. And I don't know if we've looked at that specifically in Alaska to verify that here job creation has come more from that group than from the other groups. Part of the problem here is we have such seasonality, so people don't stay in one group or the other. We have some small businesses in the winter that are quite large in the summer. So it's a long-winded answer. I'm not sure that gets you anything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack has proclaimed Southeast Alaska to be a roadless area. And Governor has challenged this classification, and the significance of that is that except for the Alaska Native ownership in Southeast Alaska, less than 1% is in private ownership. So 95% of federal land. So the classification in the area of the region, Southeast Alaska, as roadless, really sentences the region to no growth unless mines come in, mining laws still apply, so mines can be located and developed regardless of ownership. But the question is it seems like the state of Alaska ought to have a policy of conveying more land to private ownership. The Fairbanks borough has done quite a lot of this, and there's been significant growth as a result of that. But I guess the question is, to what degree is federal ownership a a barrier to attraction of investment capital and population growth?
Yeah, fascinating question. Obviously, I'll steer clear of anything policy, but Alaska, Alaska's interesting partly because it's a symbol to the rest of the country. I think you see that when the Anwar decision comes up. You see that with roadless. So we're left alone less than New Mexico might be, for example. I mean, people see us in the rest of the country as kind of the last untouched place, which is good for tourism. It's tricky for development. So I think that's an issue that we will wrestle with forever, because you have strong beliefs on both sides about what ought to be done, whether it ought to be left alone, whether it ought to be preserved, or whether it ought to be sensibly developed. You know, that the feelings really do run strong, and in a way, it's, I think, captures some of what's exciting about living here. We're majestic. We're incredibly rich in natural resources. I mean, you list them. I mean, we really, and part of it's because we have so much land, and we're a northern, country. It's not that God put His finger on Alaska or anything. We've got a whole lot of land. But yeah, again, we are most definitely a symbol to the rest of the country, not the rest of the country, to different populations. So that question will be being asked in 20 years, certainly. And I don't know what the solution is. I mean, politics, we know, wax and wane, this direction, that. Yeah, it's not going away as a question.
Mark Ryan, one of the slides that you showed was job growth. It showed the trend of job growth in it, and it had the national line on it as well as the Alaska bars.
Uh-huh.
And it shows the trend up nationally going into 2020.
Uh-huh.
Jobs was a big part of the presidential campaign, and they'd come out with their statistics, and then both parties would make their assumptions or their spin. So how can we look at what you've posted there and accept that with some reasonable certainty, I guess?
Absolutely. Well, and when that monthly job release, when that comes out, people who work with that data, reputable news sources regularly exaggerate the importance of small movements well within margins of error. So, and that's part of that's pure political craziness. People want something from the numbers, so they interpret it, so they get something from the numbers. They spin the numbers. Long term, though, I have a monthly conference call with other LMI directors who do it in other states, and we were talking about how many of them reassured audiences, and I'll reassure you that our data and the Bureau of Labor Statistics data is almost completely politics-free. The people who do that are bureaucrats, they're statisticians, they're data people. At the top level, there are some decisions being made, but those numbers don't get changed because somebody in power wants them to say something or wants them not to say something. And I do reassure you, in Alaska and to the extent we work with our federal partners, those things, they're long-running data series with well-established methodology. So and that's one of the frustrating things for me is when people don't trust our numbers because people are running around with their numbers that aren't trustworthy and we all get lumped together. But these federal data sources and these state data sources, they're pretty politics-free, like I said. Mark, does that answer your basic question? Yeah. But again, month to month, people will get excited about stuff that it's too soon. They'll say, oh, the recession's over. Oh, we're back in another recession. Neither. It's too soon. We don't know. But you string 6 months together of a trend, then you can start getting more certain. But that doesn't sell newspapers or, get views on TV programs.
Brad Flitch, Alaska Internet Network. If you were to compare our portfolio of jobs against, say, other states, we're probably going to be heavier in natural resource employment than manufacturing. But is there any really shocking industries that you would expect to find in Alaska that aren't?
No, we don't have a lot of high finance, right? Our MBAs, we look at earnings for the people here in Alaska, and there's a really interesting chart we have that shows of the people working here with master's degree, their average earnings are actually a little bit lower than the people working here with associate's degrees. And you think, well, education's supposed to pay. That's crazy. Well, education does pay, but we have a lot of people with master's degrees who are licensed clinical social workers. You know, they're in the government sectors. They don't make that much, and we have a lot of people with associate's degrees working in the oil industry in particular that make high salaries. But you're right. The biggest difference, we have a much higher percentage of oil and gas employment. We have a smaller percentage of, and seafood processing is in manufacturing in the categories. Other than that, we have very little manufacturing, and then we do have less of some of those New York, Chicago kind of, substantially less. We have MBAs, but that's not part of our economy, the finance sector. The extent we have it, it's to support our own businesses and things. But otherwise, healthcare about the same, retail trade about the same. We have a little bit more government, not a lot, a little bit. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dan. Very interesting.